So I hope you all, we're back to it, and what we're going to do today is we're going to pick up this idea of the conductile system and introduce the concept of the cardiomyocyte. And as we move our way through this, we'll recognize that there are two great divisions of cardiomyocytes. There's one cardiomyocyte type that's dedicated to simply generating and propagating electrical signals. That will be part of the conductile system. And then there's going to be another cardiomyocyte that's dedicated to contraction. And those will be the cardiomyocytes we find in the myocardium. And they have a highly developed, highly regulated contractile system with sarcomeres. The conductile system does not have much in the way of a contractile system. And if you think about those cells as being predominantly there simply to generate and propagate electrical signals, that'll go a long way to understanding what we're doing here today. What we're going to do is we're going to first start out with talking about the structure of the pacemaker and conductile systems. The heart sets its own rate and rhythm. This is an idea that we introduced when we talked about Autreloove's experiments. Remember, Autreloove went home that night and was trying to think how he could recognize the relationship between the nervous system and signaling to muscle, and he used the heart as a model system. And if you could put your phone away, I'd appreciate it. He used the heart as a model system, and the reason that he could do that is that the heart itself generates its own rate and rhythm, and then he could impose on that rate and rhythm a change by using the nervous system. But if the heart had not beat on its own, he couldn't have done those experiments. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start talking about the mechanisms which allow the heart to generate its own rate and rhythm, and these mechanisms lie in a set of cells called the pacemaker cells. And the pacemaker cells are, again, a source of the rate and rhythm. The pacemaker cells are predominantly located in two places. They're located in a bundle called the Sinoatrial Node and another bundle called the Atrioventricular Node. These two nodes, the SA node and the AV node, are connected one to another by a bundle of conductive cardiomyocytes. And we'll talk about the anatomy here. We'll generate the sinoatrial node, we'll connect those cells to the atrioventricular node, and then those cells in the atrioventricular node are going to leave the atrioventricular node and form something called the bundle of His. The bundle of His is going to be a single bundle, but it rapidly divides into two bundles, the right and left bundle branches. The right bundle branch goes to the right side of the heart, to the right ventricle. The left bundle branch goes to the left side of the heart, the left ventricle. And then these bundle branches finally branch some more, and they end up in something called Purkinje fibers. This is one of these dreadful eponymous names, but we're stuck with it. Purkinje was an early 19th century Czech physiologist. And so there are a number of things in the nervous system and the heart that we name Purkinje fibers or Purkinje cells, and named after him. These Purkinje fibers, functionally, beyond having this peculiar name, these Purkinje fibers play the role of delivering the electrical signals generated all the way back here in the SA and AV nodes to the contractile cells. So again, an example of how we'll separate the conductile and contractile systems one from the other. To understand how this system works, we have to drill down and talk a little bit about the structure of each of the cardiomyocytes. Now, there are two kinds of cardiomyocytes for sure, one being contractile, one being conductile. What they have in common is that they're all uninucleate. They are individual cells with individual nuclei. And remember, that's in real contrast to what we saw for the skeletal muscle. If you put your phone away, I'd appreciate it. The skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated, and they're multinucleate because they arose from the fusion of hundreds or thousands of individual myocytes. And as those cells then would fuse, each of those cells would contribute a nucleus. That's not true here. Here in the cardiomyocytes, they're uninucleate cells, but yet they communicate one to the next, and their communication is at a site called intercalated disks. The intercalated disks are sites where the plasma membranes of adjacent cardiomyocytes will interdigitate. They're effectively fingers of plasma membrane of adjacent cardiomyocytes that interdigitate one with another. Those fingers are held together at intercalated disks by desmosomes, but more important than desmosomes, there are gap junctions. You remember that gap junctions provide cytoplasmic continuity between cells. We talked about the gap junctions in terms of epithelial cells, and now we're seeing them in terms of cardiomyocytes, but the function is similar. That is, they provide cytoplasmic continuity, and the cytoplasmic continuity, in this case now, provides electrical continuity, so that the electrical signals generated in one cell can be propagated to all of the neighbors through these gap junctions. So we'll generate a pacemaker potential at one site and then propagate those potentials from one cell to the next through the gap junctions located at the intercalated disks. Then, once we get through the anatomy of individual cells, we'll then start talking about the distribution of ion channels within these cells. And we'll divide our worlds more starkly than we find in reality into conductal cells with one type of set of channels and contractile cells with a different set of channels. But where we want to start is talking about the peculiar set of channels we find in the pacemaker cells, in the SA and AV nodes. The cardiomyocytes that are dedicated almost entirely to doing nothing more than generating electrical signals are located in the SA nodes and AV nodes, and one of their distinguishing characteristics is to have this channel type called an Hcn channel. The Hcn channel, H stands for hyperpolarization activated, Cn is cyclic nucleotide gated channel. They're really unusual. We have not seen any channels up to now that are turned on, that are activated by a hyperpolarization. All the channels we've talked about so far, all the voltage-gated channels are turned on, they're activated by a depolarization. This is weird. It's turned on by a hyperpolarization. So it's voltage sensitive. But in addition to the voltage sensitivity of these channels, they're also gated by a cyclic nucleotide. There's effectively a cytoplasmic molecule, cyclic AMP, that acts almost like a neurotransmitter to, on the cytoplasmic side of the membrane, open these channels. The more cyclic nucleotide we have, the more hyperpolarization we have, the greater the probability these channels will open. These Hcn channels have a permeability for sodium. So they let sodium come in, and they depolarize the membrane. The function of the Hcn channels is to permit sodium to come into the cardiomyocyte, to polarize the membrane potential until it reaches threshold. But now we have threshold for a different kind of channel. This is a voltage-gated calcium channel. So we open the voltage-gated calcium channels, depolarize the membrane with the voltage-gated calcium channels with the influx of calcium, and that then causes the opening of the voltage-gated potassium channels. The membrane repolarizes, and we start all over. So through the cycle of opening an Hcn channel to let sodium in, followed by the opening of a voltage-gated calcium channel, followed by the voltage-gated potassium channel, we now set the rate and rhythm of the heart rate. We do this throughout our lives. When this stops, we stop. And we'll see as we move through this that we can change the heart rate by changing the amount of cyclic nucleotide. And by changing the amount of cyclic nucleotide, we can change the rate of sodium influx to this Hcn channel and thereby change the rate of depolarization and the rate at which these cells reach threshold to fire a voltage-gated calcium channel evoked action potential. We'll then talk a little bit about the contractile cardiomyocytes, and we'll get down into the weeds of the contractile cardiomyocytes quite a lot. But today, one of the ideas I want to emphasize is that these contractile cardiomyocytes have voltage-gated sodium channels. These guys don't have any voltage-gated sodium channels. They only have voltage-gated calcium channels. But we'll see once we get to the contractile cells, once the signal is delivered from the Purkinje fibers to the contractile cells, at that point, we now begin to invoke these voltage-gated sodium channels. We'll also discuss the idea that it's not quite so clean. You don't have two worlds quite so disparate. But for the most part, when we talk about the pacemaker cells, we're talking about these Hcn channels and voltage-gated calcium channels. When we talk about the contractile cardiomyocytes, we're talking about voltage-gated sodium channels, followed by the opening of voltage-gated calcium channels. So anything up to there? Well, if not, let's start here with our sort of anatomy of the conductile system. And we'll start here with more or less a macro anatomy. And I'll draw this, as we've seen before, where that's the right atrium. So this is the right atrium. Now, recognize as I do this that when I drew these before, I wanted to emphasize the open chamber. And I don't want to emphasize the open chamber today. What I want to emphasize is the wall, so that rather than looking at the chamber, remember, think of this as a kind of solid surface, or a hollow structure rather, so that what we're going to look at is the surface now of the right atrium and the surface of the right ventricle with the myocardium. There's, of course, the valve in between, that right atrioventricular valve. And then on the left side, there's the left atrium, the left ventricle, and then, of course, the left AV valve. We didn't discuss it very much, but there's a wall that separates the left and right ventricles. This wall I'll hash in here in orange. This is called the septum. Where I want to start is up here on the right atrium. And I'll draw this as kind of a green oval. And I'm going to label this as the Sinoatrial Node, or the SA node. The Sinoatrial node, the SA node, is a bundle or collection of conductile cardiomyocytes. There are bundles of cardiomyocytes, conductor cardiomyocytes, that come out of this structure, and I'll show 3 of them here. And the precise anatomy of this, it's not so important, but these all feed into this structure here called the atrioventricular node. Now, for the sake of completeness, there's another branch that comes out of here and goes over to the left atrium. This is called Bachmann's bundle. But it's just another bundle of conductile cardiomyocytes that are extending from the SA node over to the left atrium. The left and right atria are separated mechanically from the ventricles. And I'm going to show that by this sort of layer of purpleness. The layer of purpleness is meant to represent connective tissue. Separating the atria from the ventricles. So the only connection between the atria and the ventricles is through this conductile system. The electrical signals that will originate here in the SA node will now propagate to this structure called the AV node. And then those electrical signals will propagate out of the AV node, and they're going to propagate into a structure here called the bundle of His. This again is one of those unfortunate eponymous names. Again, named after an 18th century physiologist, 19th century physiologist. The bundle of His then separates, it bifurcates into a left and from here right bundle branch. Now then, the left and right bundle branches further divide and divide and divide. And I'll show, they'll branch and branch and branch into structures known as Purkinje fibers. The Purkinje fibers are the terminal portion of the conductile system. The function of the Purkinje fibers is to deliver electrical signals. To the contractile cardiomyocytes. So when you look at the gross anatomy of this overall structure of the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, the bundle of His, left and right bundle branches, recognize that all this in green, its function is to generate electrical signals and then propagate those signals to the business end of the heart where the muscle contraction occurs. This is simply an electrical signaling, generating, and propagating system. That's its function. This green thing is simply the conductile system. Let me show you a picture of this, a prettier picture. I won't belabor this too much. It's just such a much nicer image than what I had on the board. If I can find my... Thank you. So again, up here, this is the SA node, showing the three major branches that come down to the AV node. This doesn't show Bachmann's bundle, which would go to the left atrium. But again, recognize that this is all on the surface, that what we're trying to do is deliver electrical signals to the contractile machinery, to the contractile cardiomyocytes. And the extension from the atrioventricular node now is into the bundle of His, the right and left bundle branches. And finally, the bundle branches branch and branch and branch and end up forming termini onto the contractile cardiomyocytes. So what we have done so far is to lay out mechanically or anatomically two different regions, one of which is shown in green, this whole conductile system. And the other system, which I tried to show on the board but isn't shown very well here, is the contractile machinery of the atrial and ventricular myocardium. But let's deal first with this structure of the conductile system and then try to describe how it's going to interface with the contractile system. To do that, we have to think a little bit about the structure of cardiomyocytes. And I'll do that on the upper panel. And label this as cardiomyocyte structure. When we look at one of these cardiomyocytes, it looks a little like this. Where this cardiomyocyte has close to its center a single nucleus. It's an individual cell, and if you drill down into the cell, you find it has all the components of a typical cell. It's going to have endoplasmic reticulum, it's going to have some sarcoplasmic reticulum, it's going to have ribosomes, all of that. But it's an individual cell. But each of the individual cells makes contact with its neighbors at a site called the intercalated disk. Now, the intercalated disk is nothing more than these finger-like projections of the plasma membrane of the neighboring cells. And these finger-like projections now interdigitate one with another. And if we look closely at these sites, we'll find in here desmosomes. You'll remember that desmosomes are the mechanical junctions. They anchor cells together, and so we're going to anchor these cardiomyocytes one to the next at the desmosomes. But the more important character that we need to think about here, that we talked about some time ago when we talked about epithelial cells, are these gap junctions. When we talked about gap junctions before, we talked about them in terms of epithelial cells, and we talked about the cytoplasmic continuity. Well, that's true here. These gap junctions are going to provide cytoplasmic continuity. But more importantly, they're providing electrical continuity. Because of these gap junctions, a change in an electrical potential in this cell can be transmitted to a change in electrical potential in this cell. So the gap junctions permit these cells to be electrically connected. These green conductile cells are all connected one to another. And walking through the system above, finally we'll come down to one of these sites, which can be a conductile cell of the, let me say it's conductile cardiomyocyte. It's conductile cardiomyocyte of the Purkinje fibers. Remember that I said the Purkinje fibers are an extension of the conductile system that forms a kind of interface here. With this cell, which I'm going to label as a contractile cardiomyocyte. Once we get into the contractile cardiomyocytes, we now begin to recognize many of the structures we talked about before when we talked about skeletal muscle, where there are Z lines to form sarcomeres, there are thin filaments, and there are myosin thick filaments. Well, we'll see too that when we get down into the nuts and bolts of the contractile cells that there's a highly elaborated system of T-tubules and sarcoplasmic reticulum. So again, if you think back to the skeletal muscle story, we're going to see that once an electrical signal arrives here, we can now use that electrical signal to cause the release of calcium from the internal storage compartments to bind to the troponin C, to remove the tropomyosin, to allow the myosin head to contact the actin-thin filaments and cause muscle contraction. That's highly elaborated in these contractile cells. The conductile cells don't have much in the way of sarcomeres. They're not really very good at causing a contraction. They're basically just here to set up an electrical signal and propagate that electrical signal to deliver it to the contractile or force-generating cells. Yes?
So the cells look like they're getting bigger? Is that like what really happens, or do they stay, are they all the same?
Oh, no, the cells don't get bigger. That's a shortcoming of my drawing. Not the only one, but it is a shortcoming of my drawing. They tend to be pretty much the same size. Now, having said that, I suspect once you get down to these contractile cells, they will be a little more robust because they're pretty full of sarcoplasmic reticulum and T-tubules, which you don't see so much in these. There was another question. Thought I saw a hand waving. Yes?
So are the contractile cardiomyocytes, those just like randomly spread out throughout the heart?
So the question here is a good question about where are you going to put these contractile cardiomyocytes and how to distinguish them from the conductive cardiomyocytes. What I tried to do here is draw in green the pathway for the conductal cells. Where you'll find the contractile cells is down here in the myocardium. So
The green tracks are like nerve tracks?
the green track, okay. So your question is, are the green tracks nerve tracks? The answer is no. And that's an important concept here. Again, recognize that the heart is autorhythmic. It doesn't have to be driven by the nervous system. The nervous system is permissive. It's not directional. It's not instructive. And so the instructions for the heartbeat come from these cells, the conductile cells, the SA node and the AV node. And then they're connected one to another through gap junctions through this conductile system from the bundle of His to left and right bundle branches all the way down to the Purkinje fibers. But their function is simply to deliver electrical signals down to the contractile cells. Those contractile cells are the meat here of the myocardium. And although we haven't emphasized it here, if you take another physiology course, you'll find that the signal actually is first delivered down here to the apex of the heart. So the contraction begins here, and then there's a wave of contraction that moves up over the heart, ending toward the base of the heart from the apex. So your point is that we'll have in here stuffed full 99.9% of the cells of the heart are contractile. Only a fraction of a percent of the cells are conductile. But the conductile cells are important because without them, we neither generate nor deliver an electrical signal to tell the contractile cells to move. Okay? Yes?
How do the conductile cells create an electrical signal?
So how do the conductile cells create an electrical signal? It's a great lead into the next point. So anything else? Yes?
I was wondering, like, it's not really, they're not axons.
Okay, so are there axons? The answer is not here. We're going to see that the heart is innervated by the autonomic nervous system. So there will be preganglionics and postganglionics and all that, and they're going to then modify the electrical characteristics of the heart. You can think about these as axons, but they're not. They're not neurons. They're trigger zones, and we're going to get trigger zones up here, and that's where we want to head next, and that's the question that just came up. What we're going to do is we're going to now drill down into the channel complements in these conductile cells, particularly at the SA and AV nodes, and see how they will be generating the rate and rhythm. And we're then going to distinguish the channel complements of the conductile cells from those of the contractile cells. So, yes?
Are there 3 types of cardiomyocytes or 2? The picture you
So in our world that we have oversimplified, there are 2. There's a conductile set and there's a contractile set. And we're going to see the conductile set generates and propagates one kind of an action potential, and the contractile set generates and propagates a different kind of an action potential. That's the world we're going to paint. It's black and white. It ain't quite real. But let's hold on to that, and then maybe we can finesse it toward the end. All right. So up here on this panel, what I want to do on the left-hand side is I want to start talking about the channel complement in conductile cardiomyocytes. And we'll list these, and then we'll talk about what they do. So these are the channels of conductile, probably more accurately described as pacemaker cardiomyocytes. The three major kinds of channels in these cells are first the Hcn channels. Hcn stands for hyperpolarization. Hyperpolarization activated. Cyclic nucleotide. Gated channels. We're going to see that these cells permit sodium influx. But as we describe this, as we go through this, recognize these Hcn channels are producing a potential that's much more akin to a generator potential. The second character in this play is going to be the voltage-gated calcium channels. These voltage-gated calcium channels are responsible for the pacemaker action potential. And the third character here is going to be a voltage-gated potassium channel. And its functions we've seen before is to repolarize the membrane. Well, let's describe then in a graph the pacemaker action potential. The pacemaker action potential can be graphed as we typically do, where this is time, and this is voltage. Starts out about minus 40 millivolts. It's fairly depolarized. Maybe it's more like 60. And we see there's this slow ramp-like depolarization. And when the membrane reaches a certain point, called threshold, at that point there's an opening here of the voltage-gated calcium channels. For those of you who had some cell biology, these are the so-called L channels. These voltage-gated calcium channels open, but then they'll inactivate, kind of slowly, but they inactivate, and then there's the opening of the voltage-gated potassium channels. That, of course, repolarizes the membrane. So now the membrane potential comes back down here to about minus 60 millivolts. This period here of this so-called slow depolarization something I'll call a ramp potential. This depolarization results from opening Hcn channels. So that's the sequence. We open Hcn channels, sodium comes in, that sodium depolarizes the membrane. It's a fairly slow depolarization. If we get enough sodium coming in, we trigger voltage-gated calcium channels to open, we get an action potential, and we start all over again. But what I want to spend a little bit of time on, over here on the right, is to describe the Hcn channels. The Hcn channels are these unusual channels. We haven't seen anything like them up to now. The Hcn channel is permeable to sodium. But even though it's permeable to sodium, what opens it? It's opened by hyperpolarization. And cyclic AMP, CAMP. That's the cyclic nucleotide. If we go back and draw one of these cardiomyocytes, then there are transmembrane proteins here called the Hcn channels. The Hcn channels are actually made of 4 subunits. They have a channel in the middle. This is a sodium channel. But we can diagrammatically represent this as being 4 different subunits. Each of the subunits contains a CAMP binding site. For these channels to open and let sodium come in, 2 things have to happen. First, we need the membrane potential to be hyperpolarized into the neighborhood of minus 60 millivolts. The more hyperpolarization you have, the greater the probability the channel will open. And remember, that's really peculiar. All of the voltage-sensitive channels we've talked about so far respond to an increase in positive charge. Remember, the voltage-gated channels normally recognize an increase in positive charge. The S4 region swings or moves, the gate opens, and sodium or calcium come in. That's not true here. What we have here is a channel, the sodium channel, that's in part activated by hyperpolarization. So when we hyperpolarize the membrane, when we bring the membrane potential down around minus 60, minus 70 millivolts, that increases the probability of channel opening. But that's not the only thing that causes the sodium channel to open. The other thing that causes the sodium channel to open is the requirement of binding cyclic AMP to these cyclic AMP binding sites. The more of these binding sites we bind to cyclic AMP, the higher the probability of this channel opening. So there are 2 forces trying to open this channel. One is the degree of hyperpolarization, so they're voltage sensitive. But the other is the cytoplasmic concentration of the cyclic AMP. So if you were to take these 4 channels, I've done it badly, there are 2 here, There are 4 subunits, 2 here, 1 behind, and 1 I pulled out from the board. Each of those 4 subunits will have on it cyclic AMP binding site. Once you start getting all 4 of them bound, almost certainly that channel is going to open. If there's only 1 bound, the probability isn't very great. But there's a yin and the yang here of the degree of hyperpolarization along with the number of cyclic AMP binding sites that are occupied. So those 2 forces are leading to the probability of this channel opening. When this channel opens, sodium comes in, and that's represented by this depolarization. This is sodium influx. This is sodium influx through Hcn channels. That's just a delivery system for positive charge. That positive charge, now when we get a Duff positive charge, that we bring the membrane potential here to threshold, we open the voltage-gated voltage-gated calcium channels. The voltage-gated calcium channels generate this unusual action potential, will depolarize the membrane potential up to, plus, I think it's about 20 millivolts. Then the potassium channels open and repolarize the membrane. This happens over and over again, depending on the individual, every second or 2/3 of a second throughout life. So that the time between these peaks is 1 to maybe 1.3 seconds. I'm sorry, let me do it a little differently. Between about 0.75 and 1.2 seconds, depending on heart rate. And it's easiest to think about heart rate as 60 beats per minute. Every second you have one of these. So what's happening here? These pacemaker potentials are being generated here in the SA node. So the bundle of these pacemaker cells in the SA node are continuously undergoing this slow depolarization by Hcn channels. Then we open the voltage-gated calcium channels, which generate an action potential, and now that action potential, which has been generated here in the SA node, propagates out through Bachmann's bundle to the left atrium, but then propagates through these 3 separate roadways, if you will, to the AV node. And then in the AV node, there seems to be a little hang-up. It probably has to do with the characteristics, the membrane characteristics of the conductile cardiomyocytes in the AV node. And they take a little bit to charge up. It's probably a capacitance thing. They charge up, then they fire an action potential, just like the one above, and that propagates then into the bundle of His, into the left and right bundle branches. And in theory, then, that action potential propagates all the way down to the Purkinje fibers, and then at the end of the Purkinje fiber, there's this interface between the conductile system, this is the conductile cell, of the Purkinje fiber, and this is intended to represent a contractile cardiomyocyte. And in this simplified view, what we are thinking about is a continuous bundle of conductile cardiomyocytes, beginning here at the SA node, going to the AV node, to the bundle of His, to the left and right bundle branches, finally down to the Purkinje fibers, where it delivers the signal to the contractile cells, telling them to begin the process of shortening and generating force on the fluid in the ventricles, in the ventricular chambers. So, yes?
Is there something on the fibers allowing for capacity to prevent the
So the question here is about Let's think about this in terms of the voltage-gated channels that are in all of these cells. Okay? If we think about them as we see above, you can see that the delivery, and I wish I hadn't gotten rid of all of my conductile cells. Remember, there are going to be gap junctions here. So we can now deliver an action potential initiated at the SA node from one cell to the next through the gap junctions. And so you can think about these as being a bundle of connected cells, a bundle of electrically connected cells, so that we can propagate these electrical signals from one to the next. And if you like, you can think about those action potentials being propagated right into the contractile cardiomyocytes. In the last few minutes, what I want to do now is I want to change gears just a little bit and talk about the electrical characteristics, I'll do this in this panel, of action potentials in the contractile cardiomyocytes. Now, the way I'm going to describe this is in an ideal world where we have those conductile cardiomyocytes separated functionally from the contractile cardiomyocytes. It's not quite that simple, but let's talk about the action potential in the contractile cardiomyocyte. Again, we'll plot voltage versus time. The membrane potential here is a little more hyperpolarized, around minus 70 millivolts. Comes along, and at this point, we're going to say at this point we have the arrival of the conductile action potential. That provides positive charge. This now opens a set of channels, which are the voltage-gated sodium channels. Notice there are no voltage-gated sodium channels in that pacemaker potential. There's an Hcn channel, a voltage-gated calcium channel, and a voltage-gated potassium channel, but there's no sodium channel. Here we have a voltage-gated sodium channel. We depolarize the membrane up to about plus 30 millivolts. The sodium channel is inactivated, and then we have this great long plateau where we have open voltage-gated calcium channels, followed then by a repolarization through the use of voltage-gated potassium channels. Then about a second or so later, again arrives the pacemaker potential. Opens the voltage-gated sodium channels, depolarizes the membrane, the plateau phase, repolarization, and we start all over again. So the way I've shown this is we have two separate worlds. We have a world in green that uses these pacemaker potentials, and it's regenerative. And then we said, once we get to the contractile cardiomyocytes, we have a new kind of an action potential. The truth is a little more complicated than that, and follow me through here. I'll do it here. If we look at the cardiomyocytes here in the SA node and here in the AV node, they're pretty good at having Hcn channels that can generate that ramp potential followed by the pacemaker action potential. And in fact, in some cases, the SA node in some of us doesn't work as well as it should, and so then the AV node takes over. That's called atrial fibrillation. It's kind of dangerous. It's not nearly as dangerous as if we get fibrillation in the ventricles. And I want to finish this one story. The ventricular fibrillation is really dangerous because once these cardiomyocytes begin to quiver, they no longer can pump blood. And so you may have seen this in some sort of ER program where they roll in some guy who's had a heart attack. And some attending physician says, I need a lidocaine push. And what the physician does then is they inject lidocaine into this IV, into this individual having a heart attack. What the lidocaine does is the lidocaine blocks the voltage-gated sodium channel. So that keeps these irregular action potentials in the myocardium from occurring. So you block the voltage-gated sodium channel. And once you've done that, then you can bring these cells back into compliance with the pacemaker action potentials. In the final moment, as we get moving farther and farther more distally from the SA and AV nodes, the fewer and fewer of the Hcn channels we have, and the less ability we have to generate these generator potentials. By the time you get to the bundle of His and the left and right bundle branches, these guys are terrible at generating the generator potentials. Let's leave it at that, and we'll come back to this on Wednesday.